Behind a face that does not move, a man can think anything at all. People forget that. They stand in front of you on the gate, close enough that you can smell the wine on them, and they look into your eyes and decide there is nothing behind them. A statue. A painted thing the city props up for the visitors to photograph. They say what they like in front of you because they have decided you are furniture, and furniture does not listen, and furniture does not remember. I stood that gate for 19 years. I am an old man now, and my hands have the tremor that comes for all of us in the end, and I tell this slowly because there is no part of it I am willing to lose. But on the morning I want to tell you about, my hands were still, my back was straight under the gray wool, and the bearskin sat heavy and hot on my head the way it had sat 10,000 mornings before. I was the oldest sentry on the line. The young men called me the old stone when they thought I could not hear, which was always because I could always hear, and that is the first thing they never understand about us. We are not deaf. We are disciplined. The two things look the same from the outside, and they are not the same at all. It was autumn in Marrowgate, the good kind, when the light comes in low and gold over the stone-holed walls and the river smells of cold stone instead of summer rot. The whole city had been scrubbed for a month. The cobbles of the forecourt had been swept until they shone, the brass on the gates polished until you could shave in it, and the long banners of Varenholt hung still in air that did not move. We were expecting guests. Not the usual guests, the merchants and the petitioners and the tourists with their painted fans, but a delegation, a peace. You have to understand what that word meant to men of my age in my city to feel the weight of that morning. 20 years before, the realm of Sarn had come over the mountains. They came in the spring when the passes opened, and they came in numbers no one in Marrowgate had thought possible, and for one terrible season it looked as though Varenholt as a kingdom would simply cease, that the maps would be redrawn, and our children would grow up speaking a borrowed tongue and bowing to a borrowed crown. It did not happen. It nearly happened. The difference between the thing that nearly happened and the thing that did was paid for in a coin I will come to, in its place, because I am not ready to spend it yet. And now, 20 years on, Sarn was sending men to Marrowgate to put their names beside ours on a paper and call it finished. A treaty. The old king, our king, Edmer, who had been a young man with a thin crown when the mountains poured fire, and who was an old man with a heavy one now, the king wanted it. He had wanted it for 10 years. He said, in the one speech of his I ever heard with my own ears, that a kingdom that cannot make peace with its enemies will spend its sons making war with their grandsons, and he was tired of burying sons. So the Sarnish delegation was coming, and the city had been scrubbed, and I stood my gate in the gold light and watched the road. They came at the third bell. There were carriages, and there were horses, and there were a great many men in the deep red and iron gray of Sarn, which are not colors I will ever see without something turning over low in my chest, the way a wound turns over when the weather changes. At the head of the soldiers rode a colonel. I knew his rank before I knew his name, by the braid and the way the others fell back from his horse without being told. He was perhaps 50, broad and square, with a gray-shot beard cut close and a chest full of medals that caught the light and threw it. He rode well. He sat his horse the way a man sits who has spent more of his life mounted than afoot, and he looked at our walls, our banners, our scrubbed and shining gate, the way a butcher looks at a market stall pricing it, finding it wanting. His name, I would learn within the hour, was Vard Strel, and he had come a long way to be unimpressed by us. He drew up his horse in front of the gate in front of me and young Lyle, who stood the post to my left and was 22, and had never in his life heard a shot fired in anger. The colonel looked at us. He looked at us a long time, longer than a man looks at furniture, and for a moment I thought I will be honest, because there is no use in this story if I am not honest. For a moment I thought he saw something. But then he turned in his saddle to the officer behind him, a younger man, and he said, in our tongue, loudly enough for the whole forecourt to hear, "So these are the famous sentinels of Varenholt. I had heard so much, I expected men." He let it sit. "These are dolls. They dress them up and stand them at the door so the children have something to point at." He laughed, and the laugh was easy, and the younger officer laughed because that is what younger officers do. Look at this one. He meant me. He nudged his horse a half step closer and looked down at me from the saddle. Old as the gate itself. What do they keep you for, grandfather? To frighten the pigeons. I did not move. I will tell you exactly what was in me, because no one watching could have known it, and that is the whole of what I am trying to give you. What was in me was the smell of his colors. What was in me was a sound I had not let myself hear in 20 years, the sound the Sarnish drums made coming up the hollow valley in the dark, that flat, hard beating that you felt in the bones of your face before you heard it in your ears. What was in me, standing there in the gold autumn light while a Sarnish colonel called me grandfather and laughed, was the cold patience of a man who has already, once in his life, stood very still in front of the army this man served, and not run, and not died, when running and dying were the only two things the whole world expected of him. I did not move. Lyle beside me went white and then red, and I felt him want to speak, felt the boy's young honor straining at the leash of his discipline, and I willed him still without turning my head. There is a thing you learn, standing the gate, that you cannot teach with words. You learn that the silence is not weakness. The silence is the post. The man who keeps the post keeps the kingdom. That is not a song they sing to make us feel grand. It is a plain fact, and the day a sentinel forgets it is the day the gate is no longer guarded by a sentinel, but by a man with a grievance. And a man with a grievance is a door that any clever enemy can open. So I gave the colonel nothing. I gave him the gold light on my buttons and the iron in my spine and a face like the gate behind me. And after a moment he tired of it, the way they always tire of it. And he rode on through into the forecourt to be met by the king's stewards, and I went on standing my gate. Lyle let out his breath when they had gone. "Sergeant," he said, low, not moving his lips the way we learn to speak. "Sergeant, did you hear?" "I heard," I said. "He called you." I heard corporal. And then, because he was 22 and his face had gone red and his hands wanted to ball into fists at the seam of his trousers, I gave him the only thing I had to give him, which was the thing my own sergeant had given me on a worse morning long ago. "He is loud," I said, "because he is afraid of how the day will go. Let him be loud. Loud men spend themselves. We are not in the spending business. We stand." I do not think Lyle understood it that morning. I am not sure I understood it the morning it was given to me. But he stood, and I stood, and the colonel's laugh went away into the forecourt and the day went on. I should tell you what manner of man I had been, before I was the old stone, before I was furniture at a shining gate, so that you can carry it under everything that follows the way I carried it. I will not make it grand. The men who make their own wars grand are the men who were not in them. 20 years before, when Sarn came over the mountains, there was a place where the only road into the heart of Varenholt narrowed between two shoulders of rock, a high, cold, ugly defile that the maps called the Kettering Gap, and that the men who fought there called the Hollow, because of the way the wind moaned through it at night, like the inside of a struck bell. If Sarn took the Hollow, the road to Marrowgate lay open, and there was nothing of ours between the Hollow and the city but harvest fields and frightened farmers. It was understood, by everyone who understood anything, that the Hollow could not be held. The numbers said it could not be held. The Sarnish host that came up the valley was a thing out of a bad dream, and the force we had to set against it was a few companies of regulars and whatever the Levis could scrape together. And the regulars were commanded by a colonel of our own, who fell on the first day. I was a sergeant then. After the colonel fell and the captains after him, in the way that officers fall when the line is thin and the enemy knows where to aim, I was, by the simple arithmetic of who was still breathing and still standing, the man the rest looked to. I did not want it. No man who has had it wants it, but the looking to does not ask what you want. It only asks whether you will hold, and I found, to my own surprise, standing in that cold moaning gap with the drums coming up out of the dark, that I would. Not because I was brave. I want you to hear that. I was not brave. I was a sergeant who could not think what else to do but the next thing, and then the next thing after that, and the holding of a line is nothing more, in the end, than the doing of the next thing for longer than the enemy believes you can. We held the hollow for 11 days. I will not give you the 11 days. Some of it I have never said aloud and never will. There are men whose names I said over to myself every morning of 19 years on the gate, the way another man says a prayer, because saying their names was the rent I paid for being the one who walked out of that gap on the 12th day when so many better men did not. On the 11th day the relief came down out of the high country at last, the Levies of the eastern provinces that everyone had given up on, and they came into the Sarnish flank in the gray before dawn, and the host that had not been able to break a few hundred half-starved men in a stone throat for 11 days broke then, all at once, the way a dam breaks. They went back over the mountains. They did not come again. The treaty they were now, 20 years later, sending Colonel Vard Strel to sign was, when you cut all the velvet off it, the late and formal admission that they had never gotten past the hollow and never would. The kingdom called it a great victory. The kingdom is right to call its survivals victories. A people that cannot do that does not survive twice. They gave me a decoration, a heavy silver thing on a green ribbon, and they would have given me a commission and a soft posting and a place at the long tables if I had let them, because for a season I was a name the criers shouted and the ballad makers used. The man who held the hollow, the stone of the gap. I let none of it stick. I asked for the one thing I wanted, which was to be let alone, and to stand a quiet post somewhere the wind did not moan, and to not be a name. They thought it was modesty. It was not modesty. It was that I had spent everything I had in that gap, every coin of whatever it is that lets a man want to be looked at, and what was left of me wanted only to stand still in the gold light and guard a gate and grow slowly and quietly old. So I took the gray wool and the bearskin and the gate, and the ballads found newer men, and the criers found newer names, and the years did the kind work that years do, and after a while there was no one left in Marrowgate who looked at the old sentry on the south gate and thought, "There is the stone of the hollow." There was only the old sentry on the south gate, which was all I had ever asked to be. So you see the shape of the morning now. You see what Colonel Vard Strel of Sarn, riding up to a shining gate to sign away the last of a war he had lost, was looking at when he looked down from his horse and saw a doll old as the gate itself, kept on to frighten the pigeons. He was looking at the man who held the hollow, and he did not know it, and I was never, by any law of my own discipline, going to tell him. The exhibition was the court's idea, and it was a good idea, and like most good ideas of courts it carried inside it the seeds of a thing no one intended. To honor the delegation, and to fill the days before the signing with something other than nervous suppers, the king's people had arranged a display in the long yard, the great gravelled ground behind the stonehold where the household troops drilled. There would be horsemanship and a display of the colors, and because the Sarnish set great store by it and it would please the guests to be invited to show their skill, there would be marksmanship. A range had been set up along the south wall, the targets at their measured distances, the whole court arranged on the covered stands above to watch their soldiers, and the guest soldiers shoot in friendly turns. Friendly. That was the word in all the orders. A friendly exhibition of arms between two realms newly at peace. I was posted to the yard. Not to shoot, sentinels do not shoot in exhibitions. We stand the perimeter and the doors, that is the post. But I was on the wall near the range, in my place, in my wool and my bearskin, when the colonel and his officers came down into the long yard with the king's marshals and the whole bright court above us in the stands. Colonel Strel shot first for the guests. I will give him this without grudging it, he could shoot. He took the line with a long Sarnish rifle, the kind with the heavy octagon barrel, and he made a show of it, blowing on his hands, sighting twice, talking the whole time to the marshals in the stands in that easy carrying voice, and then he put his shots into the distant target close and clean, and turned with his arms spread to take the applause, which was generous, because a court is always generous to a guest. He shot again at the farther target, and again well, and again turned and bowed and smiled up at the stands where the king sat under the canopy, old and still, with the autumn light on his white head. And then, having shot and having been applauded, Colonel Vard Strel was not content. I have thought about why, in the long years since, and I think it is a simple thing. I think a man who has lost a war he was sure he would win carries that loss like a stone in the boot, and it does not matter how many medals they hang on him after. The stone is always there, and on the days when he is most among strangers, in the country that beat him, with their gold light on their scrubbed walls and their easy generous court applauding his pretty shooting. On those days the stone presses hardest, and a certain kind of man cannot bear it. And he must find someone smaller to set it down on. He looked around the yard for someone smaller, and his eye fell on the old sentry by the wall. "Marshal," he said loudly to the king's marshal beside him, but pitching it for the stands. "A question, your famous sentinels. We have all heard the songs, do they shoot or do they only stand?" He smiled. "In Sarn every man in uniform is a soldier first and an ornament second. I confess I am curious whether it is the other way about here." He turned and pointed the way you point at a thing, not a man, and he pointed at me. "That one, the old one. I have seen him twice now, standing like a post. I should very much like to see him do something a soldier does. Let him take the line." There was a silence in the yard, and then a kind of murmur from the stands, the murmur a crowd makes when it has been offered something it knows it should not enjoy and is going to enjoy anyway. The king's marshal, a careful man named Grieve, who had been a young officer in the war and knew, I think, at least the edges of who I was, though he had never once let it show across 19 years. The marshal said smoothly that the sentinels were not shooters of exhibitions, that they kept the doors, that surely the colonel's own marksmen. "Come," said Strel, and the easy voice had an edge under it now, the edge of a man who has decided to be amused at any cost. "We are at peace, are we not? Among friends. I ask only a friendly thing. Unless," and here he looked up at the king's canopy and let the word out slow, "unless the famous sentinels of Varenholt are famous for standing because standing is the only thing they can be trusted to do." It was very quiet then. I felt the whole weight of the long yard come around to rest on me. I felt the eyes of the stands, and the eyes of the Sarnish officers, hungry and laughing, and the eyes of young Lyle across the yard, sick with helplessness for me. And I felt, above all the rest, the eyes of my king, old Edmer under his canopy, who turned his white head and looked at me down the length of the yard. A sentinel does not leave his post. That is the first law and the last law. But a sentinel obeys his king, and the obeying of the king is the reason the post exists at all. And so there is no contradiction, only an order of things. And when the king's marshal, after a long look up at the canopy and some small unreadable sign from the old man under it, turned to me and said, quietly, formally, "Sergeant, take the line," then taking the line became the post, and I took it. I crossed the gravel of the long yard. It is a long way to cross with a court watching and a foreign colonel smiling, and I crossed it the way I cross any ground, without hurry and without dawdling, and I came to the firing line and I stood. A marksman of the household brought me a rifle and laid it in my hands, one of our own, a plain thing well kept. The colonel watched me take it with the open pleasure of a man who is about to be entertained at no cost to himself. "Slowly, grandfather," he said. "We have all afternoon. Mind the weight of it doesn't tire you." I did not answer him. I want to be plain about what happened next, because it is the part men get wrong when they tell it, and they have told it over the years in ways that make it bigger than it was. I did not perform. I did not blow on my hands or sight twice or turn for applause. I did the thing the rifle is for, in the way the rifle is for, in the way I had done it 10,000 times in the cold of the hollow, when doing it well or badly was the whole difference between morning and no morning. I set my feet. I let my breath out halfway and stopped it where the body stops on its own. I did not aim at the target the way you aim at a target. I aimed at it the way you aim at a man who is also aiming at you, which is a different thing. A thing the body remembers in the hands and the shoulders long after the mind has been let off duty. And I fired. Once at the near target, and then, because the colonel had shot twice, once at the far. 2 shots, no more. the second hard on the heels of the first, the way you fire when there is no afternoon, when there is only the next breath and the gap in the drums. Then I lowered the rifle and handed it back to the household marksman and turned to go back to my post, because the order had been to take the line, and I had taken it, and the post was the wall. I had not looked at the targets. I knew where the shots had gone the way you know in your hands, where a shot has gone the instant it leaves. There is no need to look. But the yard looked, and the yard went quiet in a new way, a way that was not the hungry murmur of before, and from the stands there came, after a moment, a sound that I had not heard turned in my direction in 20 years, and had not wanted to. The sound of a crowd that has seen something true and does not quite know what to do with it. Both shots, the marksman would say later, had gone where 2 shots go when the man firing them has spent his life past caring how they look, close and quiet and final. Colonel Strell's smile had changed. It had not gone, but it had changed, the way a thing changes that has had its inside knocked loose while the outside stays the same. He looked at the targets and then at me, the old doll crossing back to his wall, and I watched the loose thing move behind his eyes, and I knew, because I had spent 19 years learning to read men from inside a face that gave nothing back. I knew that he had felt, for one cold instant, the thing the body feels and the mind refuses, which is that he had seen that economy somewhere before, in worse weather, pointed at him. He could not place it. How could he? He had never seen my face in the hollow. No one on his side had ever seen my face. They had seen a stone throat full of gray wool men who would not break, and they had hated us, and given us a name in their tongue that I am told does not translate kindly, and gone home over the mountains. But he had felt the thing, and the feeling frightened him, and a frightened man of his kind does only one thing, which is to be louder. So as I reached my post on the wall and turned and resumed my stillness, the colonel raised his voice for the whole bright yard, and he made the mistake that no king's order and no sentinel's discipline had been able to make him make, the mistake that the next minutes would turn on, and he never felt it leave his mouth. Well shot, he said, clapping twice, slow, mocking the applause that had come from the stands. For a porter, for a doorman, you see how it is, Marshal, you can teach an old dog to fetch. The Sarnish officers laughed again dutifully, but it was thinner now, and the colonel heard it being thinner, and it drove him on. Do not mistake me. I do not say your men cannot point a rifle at a paper. I say there is a difference your songs paper over between pointing a rifle at a paper in a pretty yard and standing in the real article. War, I mean, the thing itself, the smell of it. He turned slowly, taking in the stands, the court, the king under his canopy, warming to it, the stone in his boot pressing and pressing. I have been in the real article, gentlemen. I was a young man in the worst of it. Up in your mountains, 20 years gone before peace, before all this friendship. When Sarn came down to teach Varenholt a lesson it has been careful to forget. The yard went very still. He did not feel the stillness for what it was. He thought it was a tension. It was the stillness of a great many people who had buried husbands and fathers and sons in those mountains, sitting very straight, saying nothing, because a man does not break the king's peace in the king's yard, however the guest tries him. But the colonel mistook the silence for an audience, the way he had mistaken me for furniture, and he poured himself into it. We would have done it too, he said. We had them. We had the whole campaign in our hand and the road to this very city open in front of us, but for one cursed place, a gap in the rock, the Kettering. He said our name for it wrong, the Sarnish way, but I knew which place he meant, and so, I think, did every gray head in those stands. 11 days, said the colonel, and now there was something real under the showing off, something that had been festering in him for 20 years, and had found at last a yard full of strangers to be lanced into. 11 days, a host that could have rolled over this kingdom like a cart over a snail, held up in a stone ditch by a rabble of farmers and a handful of regulars who should have run on the first morning and did not. And do you know why they did not run? He looked around and no one answered him, and he answered himself with the old fury rising in his voice. Because of one man. There was a sergeant in that gap, a nobody, a gray wool nobody whose name not one soul on our side ever learned, and this nobody would not break. We came at him for 11 days and he would not break, and he held that ditch with dead men and stubbornness until the relief came in on our flank. And that, gentlemen, is the only reason your king sits up there under his pretty canopy today instead of in a cell in Sarn. He had gone too far for the yard, and a small part of him knew it, and could not stop. I have cursed that man for 20 years, he said lower now, but in the silence everyone heard it. Every officer I lost, every friend, the campaign of my life, gentlemen, and the rank I should have, and the years I have spent being passed over by lesser men, all of it I lay at the door of one nameless ghost in a gray coat who would not have the decency to break when he was beaten. He laughed, an ugly short sound with no ease left in it at all. If I could meet that man, that one man, I think I would not know whether to kill him or kneel to him. I think about it still. I will think about it the day I die. The ghost of the hollow. He spat the name, the title the ballad makers had given me, that he must have heard from his own people's curses, and he flung his arm out toward the wall, toward the stands, toward the whole gold-lit yard of a city he had failed to take. And here I stand, 20 years on in his city, signing his peace, surrounded by his dolls and his doormen and his pretty old porters who fetch a rifle when they are told, and not one of you, he said, his voice cracking on it, not one of you is fit to have stood in that gap beside the man you sing about. I stood at my post, in my gray wool, in my hot heavy bearskin, with the autumn light on my buttons, and I listened to Colonel Vard Strel of Sarn curse me to my face for the war I had not let him win. I will tell you what was in me, because that is the whole of why I am telling you any of it. There was no triumph in me. Men think there must have been. Men think I must have stood there glowing with the secret of it, savoring it, waiting for my moment. There was none of that. What was in me was the 11 days. What was in me were the names I said every morning, the men who had stood in that gap and were fit to have stood there, more fit than I, and who were not standing anywhere now and never would again, and whom this loud, frightened man had just used as the gravel he scattered to make himself feel tall. What was in me was a grief so old it had gone quiet, the way the wind in the hollow goes quiet between gusts, and under the grief was the iron. And the iron held me at my post and gave the colonel nothing, because giving him something, stepping forward, saying the words that were swelling behind my teeth, claiming the title he had flung down like a glove he did not know was mine, giving him anything at all would have been to spend, at last, in front of a man who was not worth the spending, the one coin I had kept whole for 20 years. So I did not move. I gave him the gold light on my buttons and the iron in my spine, and a face like the gate. I would have given him that until the autumn light went out of the yard. But it was not mine to decide in the end. That is the thing I have come to understand, old as I am. A man can keep his own counsel his whole life and think the keeping is his to keep. It is not. The post is not yours. The silence is not yours. They belong to the king and to the kingdom and to the dead, and there comes a day, if you stand long enough, when the king reaches down and spends what you have saved in his own coin for his own reasons, and the only thing left to you is to let him. Under the canopy, the king rose. You must understand what that was, to those who knew the old man. Edmer did not rise. He was old, and the war had cost him in his body as it had cost all of us, and the court had long since arranged itself around the fact that the king received the world sitting. For the king to rise was a thing the whole court turned to like flowers turning. The stands fell into a silence past any silence the colonel's boasting had made. And into that silence the king's voice came down the long yard, thin and old and perfectly clear, the voice of a man who had buried sons and was tired of it and had decided in this one moment to be tired no longer. "Colonel Strel," said the king, "you say you would not know whether to kill the man who held the hollow or to kneel to him." The old man paused, and his eyes, down the length of the yard, came to rest on me and held there, gentle and terrible. "Let us spare you the choosing. He has been standing on your left for the better part of an hour. He fetched a rifle when he was told because his king told him." He has let you curse him in his own city before his own court, and has not given you the satisfaction of a single word, because that colonel is what the man who held the hollow has always done. He stands, he holds, he spends nothing. It is the only thing he has ever asked of his king, that he be allowed to stand a quiet gate and not be a name. The king's voice did not rise, but it filled the whole yard. I have honored that for 20 years. I will not honor it one breath longer while a guest of my house spends my best soldier's silence as gravel under his boots. Sergeant Tomas Reeve, step forward and be known. I have stood in a stone gap with the Sarnish drums coming up out of the dark, and I tell you that crossing the gravel of the long yard a second time, into the silence after my king spoke my name, was a harder thing. I crossed it. I came to the firing line again, and this time I turned and faced the stands and the court and my king, and I stood at attention the way I had stood it as a young sergeant a lifetime before. And the bearskin was heavy, and the wool was hot, and my old hands, for the first time in 19 years, were not quite still. I did not look at Colonel Strel, but I felt him. I felt the loose thing behind his eyes that had been knocked free by 2 quiet shots come all the way loose at last. I felt the long curse of his 20 years find, in the graveled autumn light, the face it had been cursing into the dark, and find it not a ghost, not a giant, not the monster a beaten man builds in the empty place where his victory should have been, but only an old soldier in a gray coat, tired still, asking nothing, who had been standing at his elbow the whole afternoon and had let him say every word. The colonel made a sound. It was not a word. I have heard men make it, once or twice in the worst hours of the hollow, the sound a man makes when the floor of the thing he has built his life on goes out from under him all at once. He took a step back, and then he stopped himself, because he was, under everything, a soldier, and a soldier knows the one thing that must be done when the floor goes out, which is to find your feet and do the right thing while you still can. He found his feet. The yard watched him find them, and Colonel Vard Strel of Sarn, who had ridden a long way to be unimpressed by us, who had called me a doll and a doorman and a porter and a fetching dog, who had cursed me for 20 years across 200 miles of mountain. Colonel Vard Strel came to attention, and he saluted me. It was not a small salute. He did not give it the way you give a thing you are forced to give. He gave it the way a soldier gives the highest honor he has, the salute you give across a grave, the salute you give the enemy who beat you cleanly when you can no longer pretend to yourself that he did not slow and full, and held a long moment, with his square hard face working and not steady, in front of his own officers and the whole court of the city he had failed to take. And then he said in a voice with all the easy carrying gone out of it, low and rough and for once entirely without performance, "I have hated you for 20 years, Sergeant. I think I will spend the next 20 learning how to have stood in the same world as you. I am ashamed. There is no smaller word for it, and I will not look for one. I am ashamed." And he held the salute. I returned it. What else does a soldier do? I returned the salute of the enemy who had beaten himself in front of my king, and for a moment, one moment, in the gold autumn light, in the long yard of the Stonehold, with the dead of the hollow as near to me as they have ever been, the war was over. Not the war the treaty would end with names on a paper. The other one. The one I had carried in my chest for 20 years like a wound that turns over when the weather changes. For that one moment, with the colonel's salute held trembling in the air between us, it was over, and I let it be over, and that was the only spending of myself I have ever been glad of. They signed the treaty 4 days later. There were speeches, and the criers shouted, and the ballad makers, I am told, made a great deal of the old sentry and the Sarnish colonel, most of it wrong, all of it bigger than it was. I did not go to the signing. I asked the king for the one thing I had always asked, which was to be let alone, and to stand my quiet gait, and old Edmer, who understood me better than anyone living, granted it, and laughed his thin old laugh and said I was the most stubborn man in 2 kingdoms, and the war had told him as much. Colonel Strel came to find me the morning the delegation rode out. He came to the south gate where I stood my post in the gold light, and he stood in front of me for a while, the way he had on the first morning, and this time the silence between us was a different country. At last he said, "Why did you let me say it? All of it. You could have stopped me with a word. You let me cut myself to the bone." And I told him the truest thing I know, the thing the hollow taught me and the gate kept teaching me for 19 years after. A man who holds his post, I said, does not have to win the argument. He only has to still be standing when it is over. The standing is the answer, Colonel. Everything else is noise. He thought about that a while. Then he saluted me one more time, smaller this time. A soldier's quiet courtesy and not a sacrament. And he rode out over the cobbles and away down the road toward the mountains he had failed to come through. And I never saw him again, though I heard, years after, that he had retired to a quiet country posting of his own, and had a habit, the men said, of going very still when the wind changed. I am an old man now. My hands have their tremor. I do not stand any gate any longer. They retired me with honor and a pension and the heavy silver thing on the green ribbon that I keep in a drawer and do not look at. The young men who guard the south gate now were not born when Sarn came over the mountains, and to them I am only an old soldier who comes sometimes to watch them drill, a doll, a doorman, a porter, a grandfather kept on to frighten the pigeons. They say what they like in front of me because they have decided there is nothing behind the old face, and that is right. That is exactly as it should be. I would not have it any other way, because that is the secret no loud man ever learns and no metal ever teaches, the thing I would leave you with if I leave you anything at all. The loudest man in the yard never knows he is standing in front of the quietest. The truest soldiers wear their war where no one can see it, and ask only to be let alone, and stand their post in the gold light. And spend nothing. And on the one day in 20 years when the spending is taken out of their hands, they find, to their own surprise, that the standing was the whole of it after all. I held a stone gap for 11 days when the world said it could not be held. But the hardest post I ever kept, and the one I am proudest of, was the hour I stood at a wall in a sunlit yard and let a proud man curse me to my face, and did not move, and gave him nothing, until my king reached down and spent my silence better than I could ever have spent it myself. That is the whole of it. I have not made it grand. The men who make their own wars grand were not in them. I was in mine, and I am still standing, which, as I told the colonel, is the only answer that was ever needed.